Well, this is the lecture that I've been waiting for all semester. I get to introduce you to Cornelius Van Til. And you probably have heard a little bit about him already, but now I really get to try and make the sales pitch. So I'd like to start in this lecture by quickly reviewing the main differences, as I understand it, between the evidentialist, classical, cumulative on one hand, Reformed epistemologists second, and then presuppositional apologetics. And then a brief word about Van Til. And then I'd like to address some of the theological foundations of the Christian worldview or the Christian beliefs. And then in the next lecture, discuss what we might do with some of these distinctives. So first of all, how the main three different structures, how they differ. So let's assume there's this thing, let's call it a tree, an object of knowledge, a tree that every Christian, non-Christian, everyone's trying to make sense of. So you interpret the tree through your worldview, through your noetic structure, through your beliefs. And of all of the beliefs that you have that interpret the object of knowledge or the event, let's say in this case the tree, you have a starting point, a presup. Everyone's got one. Everyone starts from somewhere. So you have a starting point or a presupposition, which, and maybe there's more than one, but at least one, which generates an entire cluster of beliefs, which we're calling our worldview. And then together that worldview will interpret the object of knowledge. So if you're an evidentialist or a classical apologist or the cumulative view, you're thinking that your beliefs interpret the object this way, and this may be different than what a non-Christian or a non-theist, how they interpret the event. And you're assuming that if I just give better arguments or more evidence, I can convince them to see it my way. The strength of this approach is that you avoid fideism. You're attempting to avoid circular reasoning, where you're just chasing your tail. And another strength is it seeks to find common ground. So we're not just talking past each other. We're assuming that if we look at the tree, we're both seeing the same thing, and we can have a conversation about it. Well, Reformed epistemology says not so fast. You see, of all of your beliefs that interpret that tree or that event, your starting point, your presupposition, or in their words, your basic belief or your control belief, that's what's most important. And in regard to those control or basic or presuppositional beliefs, Reformed epistemology says, my beliefs are rational. You can't say that my starting points, like my basic belief is I believe in God, and I'm entirely rational. I'm entirely within my epistemic rights for believing in God. Now, your starting points, let's say you don't believe in God. Well, they also may be rational because perhaps you haven't had the experience that trips your trigger to lead you to believe in God. So we all have this sensitive divinitatis, this capacity for knowledge of God. And Plantinga would say, I've had experiences in church or at Lake Michigan that have tripped the trigger from my faith in God. And so I'm entirely rational. But maybe you haven't had that experience. And so your capacity for belief in God is latent. On the other hand, Plantinga has argued that, well, maybe you're not so rational actually, because if you're a naturalist and you don't believe that there is a God, well, then how in the world would you have warrant? So it seems from my perspective that Reformed epistemology sometimes want to say that you are rational for not believing in God because you haven't had the experience that trips your trigger, while other times you're actually not rational because you can't claim warrant for anything that you know unless there's a God. Now the precepts, they're going to address even more aggressively those starting points, those presuppositions. And they're going to say that my starting points are not just rational, they're also right. And you, if you're not a Christian, again, not just not a theist, but if you're not a Christian, your starting points are neither rational nor right. In fact, you know that we're right, and you should repent. So the precepts sound more like a preacher sometimes, don't they, than a philosopher. In fact, this is what Van Til, what he really was. Um, one of my professors at Calvin Seminary, John Cooper, said that his father studied at Westminster with Van Til. And Van Til was really good in the classroom. He had a way with word pictures and analogies and metaphors, and he could really get his point across. But his points weren't always as well received among his peers, among the philosophers. You need more than just a colorful metaphor to get your point across. That works great in church, but philosophers wanted more. So there is a common view, and it's not entirely unfounded, that Van Til was sometimes a better preacher than a philosopher. But a word about just the man and a little bit about his history, then we'll get into his insights. He was born in 1895. He died in 1987, so not that long ago. He was born in the Netherlands, the Dutch Reformed man. In 1914, he graduated from Calvin College. So it's kind of interesting that anyone at Calvin, if you ask them about Van Til, they'll quickly say he's a fideist. But he actually graduated from Calvin College in 1927 to 28. He pastored a church in Spring Lake. In 1929, he was at Westminster. He left Spring Lake, took a leave of absence in 1928 to teach apologetics at Princeton. There he met J. Gresham Machen, and when Machen was forced out of Princeton for being too conservative, Machen took Van Til and started Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia in 1929. So even today, Westminster Seminary is a bastion of presuppositional apologetics, and often the Westminster Van Tilians dialogue with the folks at Calvin. And again, they're Dutch Reformed cousins, but they don't always see things quite the same way. With Machen, Van Til also founded the Orthodox Presbyterian Church. 1952, he guest lectured at Calvin Seminary and for a whole semester, and they actually offered him the presidency, but he declined. Dave Turner, a longtime New Testament prof at our seminary, said when he was teaching in Pennsylvania, he would often take his class to Philadelphia to introduce them to Van Til, and he said Van Til always struck him as just a very, very kind and gracious guy. He said once Van Til had a student named Francis Schaeffer, which you may remember. Francis Schaeffer's son is Frankie Schaeffer, who is a kind of now quite a progressive Christian, and maybe pushing back on his father, Francis Schaeffer. Francis Schaeffer was big in the 1970s, and he had this film series that a lot of churches showed about philosophy and how the culture is influencing the church. And Francis Schaeffer studied with Van Til, and they had some differences. But Turner said he remembered that when he took his class to see Van Til, and he brought up Francis Schaeffer and their differences, that it really made an impression on Dave when Van Til said, before he would discuss his disagreements, he said, "I've heard that Francis is ailing, and let's bow and pray." In the whole class, they prayed for him there. And so just Van Til was just a really, just a good guy, just a real a churchman, and had a really, I think, probably overstated some things, but had a pretty good intuition that I would like to try to convince you of. So to start with, the driving force behind Van Til's thought and presuppositional apologetics, what motivates them is they really want to oppose human autonomy and neutrality. They're really opposed to the idea that human reason is neutral, because reason itself, of course, is a tool that can be used, but it's used by someone. It's not just out there in the abstract, but someone is using this reason, and we're all born into this world with original sin. We're all born wanting to be God, and so we all have a vested interest in dethroning the true God and taking his spot. So Van Til's really going to hit hard that we should be very suspicious of human autonomy and any claims to neutrality. When it comes to God, none of us is Switzerland. We all are aggressors, and it takes the Holy Spirit to convict us and change us so that we come to Christ and lay down our arms. So that's the driving force. And philosophically, then, in order to avoid catering to human autonomy and think, allowing the person to think that they have the right to judge God, Van Til will use what he calls a transcendental argument. And we'll say more about that pretty soon. But what that means is, a deductive argument where you, like a syllogism, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. That's a deductive argument. You go from basically quite often a general statement to a particular. An inductive argument goes the opposite way, from observations of particulars, and from those observations you draw some conclusions. Now, in an inductive argument, your conclusions will be less certain than with a deductive argument, but it's how science works, doing experiments. It's how we learn about the world. It's very valuable. Well, a transcendental argument is not inductive or deductive. It's a different kind of argument. And argument is when you have to presuppose something to prove something else. It actually comes from Immanuel Kant, and it goes something like this. When you must assume something to deny it, or even when you deny it, you have to assume its existence. So it's got you, right? You can't deny something without assuming it, or even when even to deny something, you first have to assume its existence. So Van Til will say, God is like that. You can't actually deny God's existence without assuming his existence. And that's a transcendental argument. So it's not just going from particulars to a general or a general to a particular. It's saying, as Van Til would say it, what are the beams beneath the floor for anything at all? So what must be the case for rationality, for morality, for existence? Well, that would be God. So Van Til says he thinks that by using a transcendental argument, by saying, what must we presuppose even to have this conversation, that's a way of avoiding catering to human autonomy. You see, he's so afraid of encouraging people to judge God that he says, if I just give you an argument, then I'm kind of letting you be the judge. So I don't want to do that. I want to say that you don't have the right to judge God. In fact, even to have this conversation, you're assuming God's existence. So in that way, I can give you an aha moment and to kind of trip your trigger to discovering that you do believe in God, but without having you stand over him. It's actually using God to kind of undercut you and your position. That even to have this debate, even to have this conversation, you and I are both assuming God's existence. So you know he exists. And I know you know he exists. And so it can be a pretty powerful transcendental argument that Van Til offers us. But I'll stop here. The next lecture we'll talk about the theological foundations of the Christian faith that Van Til will use. Then in the third lecture we'll discuss practically how this transcendental approach will work.